It all started on a crisp, quiet Tuesday morning when I found the first letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, in my mailbox. It wasn't unusual for them to send out reminders about things like lawn maintenance or reminders about the neighborhood's unwritten decorum, but this one was different. The letter was an official notice, printed in bold, formal language, and it struck me like a punch to the gut. My tractor had officially been deemed an eyesore, a violation of community aesthetic standards. I sat there, staring at the letter, disbelief washing over me. How could this be happening? I had lived in this neighborhood for years, maintaining my property and minding my own business. My little piece of land was my sanctuary. Sure, my house wasn't the most modern, and my lawn wasn't perfectly manicured, but I had my orchard, a vegetable garden, and a hard-working old tractor that helped me keep everything running. It wasn't a flashy model by any means, just a dependable, dusty machine that had been passed down to me from my grandfather. It wasn't some flashy, loud, or unsightly piece of equipment. It was practical, and I used it for all sorts of things. Mowing the lawn, hauling mulch, clearing snow in the winter, and even tending to the garden. It was an essential part of my life, and to have it called an eyesore was a slap in the face. I took a deep breath and reread the letter, trying to process the words. The HOA was demanding that I either remove the tractor from my property or face escalating fines. The letter said that the presence of such equipment was against the community's aesthetic guidelines, specifically under the Improvement Standards for Exterior Properties section. The rules were clear. No large machinery, no unsightly vehicles, nothing that might distract from the neat and tidy appearance of the neighborhood. And my tractor, clearly, didn't fit the bill. Frustration began to bubble up inside me. I knew my neighbors well enough to know they didn't care about my tractor. They didn't mind it, in fact. It was just me and my quiet little life tucked away at the edge of the neighborhood. But now the HOA was intruding, making decisions about my property without even understanding its purpose. The thought of complying with their ridiculous demand made my blood boil. The worst part was, the HOA wasn't even offering an explanation. They didn't care about the value I placed on my tractor or how it helped me care for my home. They only cared about their perception of perfection. I put the letter down, trying to calm myself, but the anger was still simmering. I had heard rumors about the HOA before, how they loved to flex their power over the residents, forcing them to conform to their vision of what was acceptable. There had been whispers about them banning certain types of outdoor decorations, fining people for leaving their garbage cans out a few hours too long, and scrutinizing every detail of people's property. But I had never imagined they would come after something as practical as my tractor. It was absurd. I was at a crossroads. I could just remove the tractor, let the HOA have its victory, and avoid the hassle of fighting back. Or I could take a stand. I wasn't the type to back down easily, and I wasn't about to let some arbitrary rule dictate how I lived. I decided I wasn't going to give in so easily. If they wanted a fight, I was prepared to give it to them. But little did I know that my resolve would soon be tested in ways I never expected. The days following the letter from the HOA were filled with a constant sense of tension. I couldn't focus on anything else. The tractor, my trusty companion for years, now felt like a symbol of rebellion. Every time I looked out the window, I saw it sitting there on my property, still under threat. It was as though the HOA was stalking me through their rules, trying to strip away the very things that made my life simpler. The pressure was mounting. Each morning, I would wake up, coffee in hand, ready to tackle the day's chores, only to be reminded of the looming HOA deadline. The letter stated that I had 10 days to remove the tractor, or the fines would begin to pile up. 10 days. The clock was ticking, and every tick felt louder than the last. As the days passed, I started to feel a growing sense of isolation. It wasn't that the neighbors were unfriendly. They were mostly pleasant, though we kept to ourselves. But the HOA wasn't like a group of friends you could have an open conversation with. They were faceless, anonymous enforcers of rules. I hadn't even received a single visit from a board member to explain their decision. Instead, I was left to stew over their demands in silence, feeling like a lone rebel up against an invisible enemy. The weather had been fairly mild that week, so I found solace in working outside. I spent my mornings in the orchard, trimming back overgrown branches and prepping for the growing season. The tractor still sat there, waiting patiently for its next task, but it was hard to look at it without the sense of dread creeping in. I wanted to keep my cool, to focus on the bigger picture, but the HOA's message kept swirling in my mind, gnawing away at my peace. Then, on Friday afternoon, I caught the news of an incoming snowstorm. The forecast was clear. This storm was going to be massive. The meteorologists were calling for up to 30 inches of snow, high winds, and temperatures that would dip well below freezing. It was going to be one of those storms that you could feel in your bones before it even arrived. People were advised to prepare for power outages, traffic disruptions, and the possibility of being stuck indoors for days. I wasn't one to panic about snowstorms. After all, I had lived through more than a few in my lifetime, but something about this one felt different. The snow was supposed to fall in heavy, wet clumps, making it difficult to clear with traditional snowblowers or shovels. My tractor, however, was built for this kind of weather. I had a snowplow attachment that could easily handle the storm's worst. I made a mental note to ensure the tractor was fueled up and ready to go when the storm hit. But as I prepared for the snowstorm, another thought began to gnaw at me: the HOA. They had already banned my tractor. What would they think if they saw me using it to clear the neighborhood's snow? The irony was hard to ignore. Here I was, on the verge of becoming a neighborhood hero, and yet the very thing that was supposed to bring people together was being criticized by the same group of people who had banned it. Despite my growing irritation, I pushed those thoughts aside. There was no time to waste worrying about the HOA right now. I focused on what I could control: the storm. I checked the weather updates, made sure the generator was in working order, and stocked up on supplies. The neighbors would need help when the snow started piling up, and I was more than ready to offer it. In the back of my mind, though, I couldn't help but wonder. When the snowstorm arrived, would the HOA still see my tractor as an eyesore, or would they finally understand its value? The snowstorm arrived right on schedule, and with it came an intensity that no one had truly anticipated. The sky turned a dark, foreboding gray, and within hours, the snow began to fall. At first, it was light, almost picturesque, a soft dusting that made the trees look like something out of a winter postcard. But that calm didn't last long. The snow soon picked up, turning into heavy, wet flakes that clung to everything in sight. The wind howled, and within minutes, visibility was reduced to almost nothing. The world around me seemed to disappear beneath a thick, white blanket. I wasn't worried about being stuck inside. After all, I had grown accustomed to harsh winters, and I was well prepared. I grabbed a cup of coffee and watched the storm from my window, knowing that soon enough I would be out there battling the snow. As the day wore on, the snowfall grew heavier, and the streets outside started to disappear. By mid-afternoon, the snow had piled up to several inches, making it impossible to navigate the neighborhood without serious effort. The power flickered a few times, then went out completely. I knew the storm was only going to get worse, and I couldn't sit idly by. I suited up in layers, pulling on my boots and gloves, and headed outside. The wind had picked up, making the cold bite deeper, but my focus was on the task ahead. I fired up the tractor, which roared to life like an old friend who had been waiting for this moment. It was time to clear the driveway. I had a snowplow attachment that would easily push through the heavy, wet snow that was accumulating. With each pass, I watched as the driveway slowly cleared. It was satisfying, the snow parting like a stubborn wall breaking apart under pressure. I took my time, methodically working through the snow that had accumulated across the driveway. But as I worked, I began to notice the neighboring houses. More specifically, my neighbors. I could see them from my position, huddled inside their windows, watching the snow pile up. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the hours passed, I realized no one else was out clearing their driveways. A few of them had shovels, and I could see them struggling against the accumulating snow, making little headway as the storm raged on. Some were trying to clear snow with small, ineffective snowblowers, but those were hardly built for the depth and weight of the snow that had fallen. They were failing, stuck, and unable to dig themselves out. Meanwhile, my tractor moved through the snow with ease, carving a path through the white landscape like a hot knife through butter. The snowstorm wasn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. It was a full-blown crisis. People couldn't leave their homes. The streets were impassable. I knew that if things didn't change soon, some of my neighbors could be in serious trouble. But I wasn't sure what to do. Should I offer to help? After all, the HOA had just made it clear they didn't like my tractor, but would they want to look like hypocrites by asking for my help? Then I saw it. Someone's car was buried under the snow right in the middle of the street. The driveway it was parked in had been neglected, and now the car was stuck in what was quickly becoming a thick snowdrift. That was it. The sight of someone else's predicament pushed me past the point of hesitation. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I turned the tractor in the direction of my neighbor's house, and without a second thought, I began to plow the street. As I worked, more neighbors began to appear at their windows, watching me clear their driveways and the paths leading to their homes. And then, one by one, they started coming out into the snow, shovels in hand, asking if I could help them. They didn't say much at first, just looking at the tractor in awe. But it didn't take long for the reality to set in. The storm was bigger than anyone had expected, and they were struggling to keep up. By the time the snowstorm reached its peak, I had cleared the entire block. My neighbors were grateful, but there was a strange tension in the air. Some of them were still unsure about the tractor, but the storm had forced their hand. They saw its value now. And me? I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. As the snowstorm raged on, the tractor became more than just a tool. It became a lifeline for everyone in the neighborhood. Little did I know, this would be the moment when the HOA, the very organization that had threatened to take away my tractor, would come knocking at my door. The storm raged on through the night, its fury unchecked. By the time the snow had finally begun to taper off, the world outside looked like a winter wonderland, beautiful, but still dangerous. The streets were buried under thick layers of snow, and the silence that followed the storm was almost eerie. There was a strange stillness, as if everything had been reset, waiting for someone to make the first move. I had spent most of the evening making sure my neighbors were safe and that their driveways were cleared. It wasn't just about clearing the snow at this point, it was about looking out for each other. After all, in a storm like this, no one could make it alone. I'd been out there for hours, but I couldn't stop thinking about one thing: the HOA. I had no idea if they would come knocking on my door, but the thought of them asking for my help after what they'd done filled me with both anticipation and dread. Part of me wanted to tell them they were on their own, that they had been wrong to come after me. But another part of me, one that had seen how desperate the situation had become, knew what I had to do. By the time I had finished clearing the last driveway, it was nearly midnight. I pulled the tractor into my garage, the engine humming softly before I shut it off. The wind outside was still howling, but there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. I had done what needed to be done, and I didn't regret a minute of it. Just as I started to head back inside, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. Who could it be at this hour? My first instinct was to ignore it, but then the realization hit me. It was the HOA. I hesitated, but then walked to the door and opened it. Standing on my porch were two of the HOA board members, both of them wrapped up in heavy coats, their faces pale and windswept from the storm. They didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at me. The man, whose name I recognized as Frank, seemed especially uncomfortable. His face was flushed, and his eyes darted nervously, almost as if he were looking for an escape. The woman next to him, Marissa, was more composed but equally anxious. We need to talk," Frank began, his voice unusually quiet. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. There was nothing left to say at that point, was there? After everything they had done, now they were here asking for help? Marissa spoke up, cutting the silence. We have a problem. The storm. It's worse than we thought. The HOA's snowplows broke down and the streets are completely impassable. We can't get anything out of here. And, well, She paused, looking embarrassed. We're hoping you can help. We saw what you were doing earlier with your tractor, and frankly, we don't have a choice. I stood there, staring at them for a moment, the irony of the situation sinking in. These were the same people who had sent me that letter just days ago, demanding I remove my tractor because it was an eyesore. The same people who thought their arbitrary rules were more important than the practicality of living in the real world. And now they were standing on my doorstep, practically begging for the use of my tractor. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. There was so much I wanted to say, but I knew this wasn't the time for a confrontation. These were the people who had made my life difficult, but now they were in a bind. They needed help, and I had a choice to make. "I'm not sure if you understand," I said, choosing my words carefully, "but you're the ones who told me to get rid of my tractor. Now you want me to save you?" Frank and Marissa exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Frank cleared his throat. "We know, and we were wrong. We didn't understand how important it was. We didn't think we'd need it for something like this. We've been so focused on keeping the neighborhood perfect that we lost sight of what really matters. Please, we need your help. The streets are blocked, people are stranded, and the emergency crews can't get through. We have no other choice." For a moment, I just stood there, letting their words sink in. I could see the genuine worry in their eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. As much as I wanted to let my anger fester, I realized that helping them wasn't just about saving face, it was about doing what was right. I could turn them away, but that wouldn't solve anything. People in the neighborhood were in need, and despite everything, I was the one who had the means to help. "All right," I said finally, breaking the silence. "I'll help you. But you need to understand that this isn't just about the tractor. It's about working together. It's about this community. I'll clear the streets, but you need to start looking at things differently. How you enforce your rules, how you treat your neighbors. This can't just be about appearances anymore." They nodded in agreement, their expressions softening with understanding. I stepped back, gesturing for them to come inside for a moment to warm up before we went out to clear the streets. As we walked toward the tractor, I realized that this could be a turning point. Not just for me, but for the neighborhood. Maybe the HOA would start to see that sometimes practicality mattered more than perfection. Maybe they'd learned something that night. By the time the storm finally subsided, we had cleared the entire neighborhood. The roads were passable, and the people who had been stranded were finally able to get out. And as for the HOA, they had a new perspective. The following week, I received a letter, this time not one of threats, but of apology. They acknowledged their mistake and lifted the ban on my tractor. They even promised to revisit their bylaws, making sure that practicality would be given its due respect. It wasn't just about the tractor anymore. It was about understanding what it meant to be a community, to rely on one another in times of need. And in that moment, I realized that the storm had brought about more than just clearing snow. It had cleared the way for something better.